Greetings, dear listener. You're listening to the Jaunty Mantis podcast. This is Jesse,
This is Maddie.
and we are presenting to you today a special bonus episode.
True
Why?
story.
Yeah, why do we do these?
Well, the Jaunty Mantis is released in seasons, 12 episodes per. And the reason for that is so we have time to take a breather, get extra recordings done, make sure we don't fall behind. So if you're listening to this, that means that we're in between seasons.
We made it.
So we'll be back soon. And until then, enjoy this episode, this bonus episode. It's not necessarily about role playing game topics, but it is very nerd adjacent.
And we hope you enjoy it.
Yep.
Hey, all you listeners out there in Radio Land. You're listening to the Jaunty Mantis podcast, a tabletop role playing game podcast full of creative questions for curious gamers. I'm Jesse, and with me, as always, is my co host.
That's me, Maddie. I'm Jesse's AI companion. Jesse, I have a question for you.
Sure, shoot.
Do you listen to any gaming podcasts?
You know, I do. I listen to rather a lot of them. Do you listen to any gaming podcasts?
Oh, hell no. I mean, I used to. I just don't really listen to that many podcasts anymore. So by default, not that I have anything against gaming podcasts, but right now I'm not really listening to any gaming podcasts unless you count this one when I edit it.
Mm-hmm. I listened to this one as well, and I've given it a 5-star review.
And listener, if you want to support the Jaunty Mantis, go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a star review and some kind words.
And if you want to support any of the other podcasts we're about to talk about, please go check them out. I think they're really great.
Yeah, maybe we'll have Jesse give us some links. And we'll put those in the episode notes.
So why don't you listen to podcasts anymore?
I don't listen to podcasts anymore because I've been okay. So this is going to be a long story, and I apologize, but I've been listening to podcasts since 2007. I got into it very, very early days.
Yes,
And
I also did it before it was cool.
I don't think podcasting has ever been cool. I don't know what you're talking about, Jesse.
Wait, then why are we doing this?
Because we have fun. And
Right. Okay.
it's an excuse to talk to each other every week outside of our Sunday game. But I used to listen to podcasts starting back in 2007, and I started as a way to ignore my then live with girlfriend because problems, relationships, I don't want to deal with it. Just put some headphones in my ears and I'll listen to a podcast. And then I found it was a very creative way to kind of like shuffle out the background noise and either give myself something to focus on or to give myself something to ignore while I got work done or whatever the case may be. And then it became something that I just had in my ears all the time, right? So if I was driving, I'd have it playing over the car stereo. If I was at Target or a grocery store or just walking around, I would always have headphones in my ears listening to a podcast. If I'm doing anything in the apartment, if I'm, working, podcasts in the ears all the time. And I started to get the feeling like I was self-isolating from reality. And this realization came with COVID because the way I experienced COVID was I was living by myself. I took things very seriously and I didn't see or talk to anybody in person for 15 months. I was by myself for 15 months, no in person human contact for 15 months straight. And it really messed me up. Like, I can't watch certain kinds of entertainment anymore. If it doesn't have like a wizarding school or a robot or a dragon or magic or whatever in it, like I can't watch it. I can't watch anything serious. I don't know why. COVID. But same thing with podcasts is like I started to realize that I was self-isolating from reality and I was just sinking deeper and deeper in to this self-isolation. So, long story long, that's why I don't listen to podcasts anymore so I can actually experience the world as it's happening.
Well, That's well reasoned and thoughtful, and I support you in your journey. I'm also imagining the alternate universe where you like decided at the bottom of that arc to just give InfoWars a try for irony, and are now there's a version of you that's just like a complete and total like conspiracy theory fascist out there.
Yeah.
And it's become increasingly hard for the version of me in that universe that doesn't have a beard to still be friends with it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's many different variations of Maddie in the multiverse for sure.
Yeah, I've actually been called out by my wife for like disconnecting for having a podcast in, and I'm just like, I'm washing dishes. Like,
Yeah.
this is not an optimal time to talk to me anyway, because I can't hear you over the water running over the dishes. But
Right.
yeah, I think I'm not that bad. It's just when I wash the dishes or mow the yard or I'm driving to work.
Yeah. And I want to preface that this is not a judgment on anybody else. If they listen to tons of podcasts, I suffer from depression. It's hereditary. It's through the men in my family. And my depression is very self-isolating. It removes me from reality, from friends. And if I don't keep it in check, and if I disconnect from reality through podcasts or whatever, there's many other distractions I could present myself with. So that's just a part of who I am. If you listen to podcasts and you love them, you listen to them all day and all night, more power to you.
Cool.
Okay, now that the uncomfortable part's out of the way,
I
Jesse,
don't know why that was uncomfortable. We can be
tell
real.
me, tell me about a podcast you love.
I'm fixated on this idea because you just for a second there opened the door on unpacking what we all went through on COVID, and I just walked around like I've spent like the last like 2 years being like, so are we just never going to talk about that? Like, what's going on? Like, we're just
Oh
never
yeah,
gonna. I guess that's where we decided to go. So I just have a
yeah,
story to share with you, if
go
that's
for it.
okay. Where
Totally.
one of those moments just like struck me like a Mack truck.
Hmm.
Uh, I was doing bedtime books. I might have told you this story, but I don't know if I've talked about it. And there was this book called It Got Quiet, and I had no idea what it was about.
Oh
And
geez.
Lottie is sitting on my lap, and I start reading it, and just like one day, everyone had to go inside. And then about page 3, when there's like the ghosts of all the people that have died, I'm just like,
Oh my God.
like Lottie's like, "What's wrong, Daddy?" I'm like, "Pandemic." Like, so yeah, it was yeah.
Yeah.
But
Uh,
now I've figured out how to solve that because I have my Ugly Cry album I can just listen to, and that way those things don't get bottled up.
Ugly Cry album or Ugly Cry playlist that we started
Oh,
together.
I found the pure crystalline form. I found the China White of the Time to Cry It Out playlist.
Yeah.
I put
So,
a song from it at the end of the playlist. If you're feeling brave, it's waiting there.
okay, yeah.
Like Matt crying as a time bomb.
So for our listeners, when 2020, the year was 2020, when the pandemic hit, Jesse and I, and eventually invited mutual friend Shannon, who did our awesome graphics. Thank you, Shannon, for the
Shannon
Jaunty
rocks.
Mantis. Um, we invited her to participate as well, but we created a shared playlist that was basically like the COVID-19 Time to Cry It Out playlist because we both knew that whatever was about to happen, we were just going to need to do some crying.
Because otherwise, you're just going to like wander around in a haze,
Hmm.
like unemployed and like coming up with names for all the birds in your backyard, which was actually lovely. I still see Grumps, the hawk from time to time. He has this one
That's
branch he
good.
likes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I told other people about this playlist and they're like, you're a crazy person. Why would you do this? And I was like, I don't know, because men don't fucking deal with their emotions and
Because you're
crying.
going to get so fucking numb from the incredible, unceasing onslaught of bad news, fear, and paranoia that you're
Mhm.
just going to lock your own heart into a cave of ice unless you vent. And you probably don't want to vent by being mad at someone you care about
Right, right.
over the phone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the problem, one of the biggest problems with COVID is that as a society, we haven't fully even started to come to terms with what happened and the fallout from it and all the other things. And that that is going to come due. I'm a
Well, I
big
mean,
fan
they
of
didn't with the
therapy.
Spanish flu either. In the next 20 years, we're fine.
Right. Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if listener, if you're still here with us, Jesse's going to tell us about a podcast, a gaming podcast he loves.
Okay. So I have a couple different buckets I can put the podcasts that I really like into. And so the first one is British. And I think I gotta highly, highly
Yep.
recommend this one, The Grognard Files.
Nice.
And I think as I say that, listener, you're probably making some assumptions about grognards because you're thinking of the context of American grognards and arguing on the internet. And these are actually just two lovely guys in their 50s that go down to the pub when they can and it's not COVID and like talk about like White Dwarf magazine issues from like the 1980s and playing like uh oh what is the game called? Glorantha, RuneQuest, playing RuneQuest
Oh,
and
wow.
Call of Cthulhu and all these things. And like, I know the arc of RPGs in North America, right? I,
Mhm.
I know that. Listening to this is like getting this window into this entire, like, alternate dimension version of the culture, just narrated by two, like, incredibly pleasant dudes in their 50s who both have kind of like the north of England accents, and it's very soothing. Like
Mhm.
you could put it on. I wouldn't say to fall asleep, but like I feel my blood pressure just lowers. Like it's the same thing listening to Garrison Keeler did for me,
Mhm.
back in the day. So yeah, and it's really great. They play modern games. They've actually got wildly successful with a podcast. Uh they have a convention. Um they have guests on all the time, and I get to hear about like this whole. It's the thing that made me buy Pendragon because they're all about those early Chaosium games like RuneQuest and Call of Cthulhu and Pendragon. And then I bought Pendragon and ran it, and I was like, this is incredible. Um, so yeah, I really, really like the Grognard Files as one of my Brit podcasts. I've talked your ear off about Grognard Files before, right, Maddie?
You have, and I'm going to mention one of my favorite all-time podcasts, which just happens to be a gaming podcast that I don't think they're doing anymore. And I would say that is definitely a spiritual cousin to us, as well as the podcast you just mentioned, which was Hardy Dice Friends.
Oh,
Very different
Rest in Power
show,
Kings.
very different show than us. We're not in their league at all, but I think
Yeah.
thematically we have a spiritual connection, which is like two really good friends just talking about gaming in the way that they always do, and they're just pressing record and made it into a show. And so the Grognard Files, as you mentioned, I feel is also like a spiritual cousin to us in that sense, where, a lot of people don't understand this about podcasting is that like I think the core of good podcasting is the chemistry between the hosts and the relationship between them. And when I did listen to tons of podcasts, there's nothing I hated more than a podcast with people that are on it that should be talking to each other, but they don't have that personal, like passionate connection with each other of best friends or good friends or whatever the case may be. And so I would recommend going and listening to Hardy Dice Friends, even though they don't make it anymore. Go and listen to every single episode. It's a fucking delight. It's one of my favorite podcasts of any genre.
It's so goddamn funny. And while we may at points in our lives be as depressed as Grant Howitt, we will never be as funny as that man.
Oh, true. So true. Yeah, they are working on a level that is far beyond us. And I would never even want to be as insulting to put us in the same category of them as far as the quality of the kind of content they are putting out. Like they would just have a segment of the show where they would just design a new role-playing game around like a fucking ridiculous idea that was often contributed by the listeners of the show. And their ability to just like fucking instantaneously just start creating mechanics and thematics around what is essentially the inside jokes of the show and to just keep it going. Like I was always like marveling at their talent for mechanics and creativity and their true understanding of how role-playing games work.
The third proudest day of my life was when they read my question.
Uh-huh. Yeah. All right, Jesse, tell me about another podcast, a gaming podcast you love.
Also in the British realm, what would the Smart Party do?
Yeah, I've heard this one before. Very good.
So they have a great title,
Hmm.
first off. But I would say that like in the back part of their catalog that I've been listening to, what would the Smart Party do is be like, hey, do you want to drop a lot of money on a Kickstarter? Because these guys are going to interview a guy who's got a Kickstarter going right now. And when you hear the guy whose Kickstarter is going, talk about his game, you're really going to want to buy it. Um, they do retrospectives. They have questions very kind of similar to the questions we ask. Um, Not exactly the same, but they'll some episodes are interview episodes, some episodes are those. They have formal structure. They've got some nice bagpipe and drum music for kicking it off. And they just seem like some really great dudes that you should give them a listen.
Yeah, for sure. I've checked out this podcast before. Um, it's definitely worth a listen. It's definitely worth checking out.
That
And
was on
there's
my list, right? When we
there,
started this.
yeah, yeah. When we talked about doing the John T. Mantis officially as a podcast, we both gave each other like good and bad examples, or good and mediocre examples, I should say, of like what we did and didn't want podcasts to be about. Um, uh, I mean, that's the way I did it. I don't remember if Jesse gave me a bad or mediocre example, but I definitely gave him one where I was like, here's how I don't want this to go, and here's some that this is how I do want them to go.
So key sneak pack to those halcyon days at the formation of the John T. Mantis podcast. I said on the record to Maddie, I don't really like the ones where it's just like two or three people talking and they just banter. Like
That's
like
so true.
I feel like yeah, we need to have segments, we need to have structure. And hey, listener, maybe you're being like, yeah, you guys do. Like, well, too bad. That takes a lot of work. So yeah, and then I listened to some of the ones on Maddie's list. I was like, oh, okay, this can actually be entertaining and engaging. I just was not listening to the right people doing it. And
Yeah,
then we did our first episode, and I was like, I think we might be kind of the right people doing it.
yeah, yeah. A perfect example of this, not a gaming podcast, but the Uncanny X Cast was a podcast of two guys who were friends in high school. There was a time period where they weren't in like heavy contact with each other. Then they got back in each other's lives, and they had X-Men comics as a shared love. And one of the guys had kept reading and knew everything there was about X-Men comics, and the other one was just getting back into it. And their episodes would be like 3 hours long. And this is like early days, back when everybody was like, no, a podcast needs to be very short and brief. In fact, people still say that to me, and I go, "You obviously don't listen to podcasts." But their chemistry alone was a reason to listen to that show, because even if you didn't know anything about the X-Men, just listening to them like just talk with each other was just like such a nice, wholesome, beneficial thing to have, because people with great chemistry have great conversations.
Yep. And we like to pretend that we do too. So now we know
I,
we're good. It's all right. It's all right.
uh,
I don't have to be fake humble.
No, I mean, like, look, the whole point of the Jaunty Mantis was like, let's just do this the way that we want to do it. Let's do episodes that we want to do. Let's do them in the way that we want to do them, and not kowtow to potential success or other expectations, because this isn't exactly a gaming podcast. But I brought it up before, but there's the Dungeon Craft YouTube channel, Professor Dungeon Master, something I used to watch or listen to whenever he put out an episode, and now not so much. And the reason for it is his earlier content was more up my alley of like great tips and advice and tools to use to make and run games. And then he started doing industry commentary videos, and those clearly were getting way better responses and more viewers from the audience out there. So he did more of those. And I stopped subscribing to the channel and stopped watching the content because that's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in piling on about how Wizard of the Coast is ruining the hobby or whatever. Not to say that that's what his videos were about, but just not interested in industry commentary. I'm interested in like the finite nuances that this guy is using to prove that his style of running games works and there's a lot to learn. So I would recommend that. It's not a podcast, but I would recommend the early days, early of the Dungeon Craft YouTube channel.
Cool. I think next on my list, we're going to leave those green and mist shrouded isles and come back to the mega continent that is North America. And I'm going to start with the one that really like firmly planted the OSR flag in my heart, and that's Fear of a Black Dragon.
Oh yeah, that one's awesome.
So, Fear of a Black Dragon is people from the Gauntlet, including Jason Cordova, who wrote a couple of the books we're reviewing and see. Well, one of the books we're reviewing in season 3, um, and it's just they're segmented. They have a series of running segments like the Expert Delve, and further reading where they're just like, hey, what would you do to spice this one up? They pick an OSR adventure module or setting, talk about it, and it follows the same format. And it's a really interesting conversation because they take these things like these old school adventure modules or something from like Dragon Magazine or Dungeon Magazine issue 1, and then talk about how they're running it in a modern story game like Trophy Dark or Trophy Gold. And it's just fascinating to hear. And I love it. And I'm like, oh, this is so cool. And one of the things in a recent episode that's got me spinning is just like dungeon crawling is a horror game. It's like Jason Cordova's like point he staked out on this episode. Like you are going into the dark to face horrible. It's a horror experience. I know it's not everybody runs it that way, but I think it is. And I was like, yes, yes, it's a horror experience.
Yeah. Yeah. That is I think in the same vein is one that I definitely used to listen to, which is Discern Realities, which is also Cordova. That is, I'm not usually a fan of actual plays, but Discern Realities was a Dungeon World podcast that had a bit of an actual play element into it, but it was just chocked full of great resources to use for Dungeon World. Like, here's how to use the mechanics. Here's how to create like an idol that produces an effect or a power, or here's a magic item, or here's a cool monster, or whatever the case may be. And it really does speak to the talent of Cordova and the other people on the podcast that like that they could maintain that style for so long with so much useful information. I think they ended up making zines out of the content as well. And I if you're looking to get into Dungeon World, Discern Realities is a fucking brilliant entry point to just fully be able to, realize what that game has to offer.
Yeah, and if you're looking to get into story games, particularly ones more aligned with OSR sensibilities, just go to the Gauntlet or look up the
So
Gauntlet
true.
on drive through and download, I don't know. I mean, the games, I really want to play Brindlewood Bay. Um, Brindlewood Bay is the story RPG of being like a book club of like elderly women that also start solving murders that grow increasingly occult and enter into the Cthulhu mythos
Oh
before too
man, I love
long.
it.
And like, what a concept. Um, yeah, just so many great weird horror games and exploring spaces in the hobby that I don't feel like a lot of people are doing, and they're really well put together.
Right on.
Uh, I think then next, I'm just gonna have to shout out the guys on the Glitter Boys. The
So
Glitter
true.
Boys is a Palladium fan podcast, and I could not have done my my Riffs campaign without listening to them because the love of these two old grognards, and then there's a third host that's been added, like for just all things Palladium. They do it book by book. Sometimes they'll be like, hey, what's character creation like in this? Or is combat actually that hard? Or the two episodes about how missile combat work. Uh, but they're funny and they're engaging and, they're kind of my age and whatever. I just really like it. So if you want to hear like people be kind of obsessive, well, you're a nerd, you're listening to this. If you want to hear people be obsessive about something you may not know about and catch a little bit of their obsession, I highly recommend the Glitter Boys podcast. And it's Glitter Boys BOIS.
Perfect. I would for my next pick, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Manifest Zone, the Eberron podcast that actually has Keith Baker on it. I don't think they make it anymore, but if you have any interest in Eberron whatsoever, just being able to listen to the guy who created the setting go into detail about, this is where the idea came for this, or this is why elves work the way they do. The way he fleshes out Eberron and what you can do with Eberron and is amazing. And some of the material has come from his blog. And there is kind of like a rotating door of co-hosts over the time period that the podcast has been on, but every episode is worth listening to. If you have any interest in Eberron and you love podcasts, you should check out Manifest Zone.
And then I'm just gonna throw this one out too as being also very niche. The Systematic Understanding of Everything is an Exalted podcast with a lot of the developers and a very enthusiastic guy who is not a developer who asks really great questions, where they kind of go through the Exalted rules and the Exalting setting episode by episode. And I mean, again, it's a game where system matter masters and the world is so cool. But if you got someone who's into podcast and you're thinking about running an Exalted game, be like, hey, here's kind of 40 episodes that by the end of it, you are going to know as much about this as I do. And you'll be able to play it really well. And they had a whole mini series about the Exalted Essence Edition, the rules lighter one that like listening to it, I was like, oh my God, this is playable. I have to do this. So that's slated as a campaign for one of my live groups now. It's nerds who are passionate about something who like each other talking about that thing they like. I find it very engaging.
Awesome. I would say, my next suggestion is a podcast called Mastering Dungeons. It's a podcast hosted by two game designers, and they do talk about the industry and they do talk about the hobby from a certain perspective, but I think it's done without the desire to maximize clicks. So I don't think they're trying to be controversial or confrontational. I don't think they're trying to attract that kind of attention. I just think that they have a perspective. They know people in the industry. They know how things work, and their episodes can often be very enlightening about like the industry as a whole and certain products. And they have certain reflection episodes where they talk about the hobby, like they talk about 5e 2014 and from like an episode by episode perspective of like, in certain stages of how it developed. And I think there's a kind of like an archive or historical museum or curated esque aspect of this podcast that I think is worth checking out.
Cool. I was going to also shout out a similar one. And if, as we're going through this, if you want to claim Painty Man, that's okay. So,
No, you should claim painting, man. I don't actually paint.
yeah, but you still listen to. Okay. So anyway, and that's credit to it. I was going to say the Lazy RPG podcast, which is Michael Shea, aka Sly Flourish, aka the Lazy Dungeon Master. It's just expounding on things from his blog, a little bit of industry news, but like, and that's actually why Maddie and I, if you're watching the video of this, smiled when he said 5e 2014, because the episode of this I listened to today, had like a whole section about like I think this is what we should use as the naming conventions for talking about these going forward. D&D 2014 or 5e 2014 and 5e 2024. And he made a very well-reasoned argument for it that I won't repeat here because you should go listen to him, but I agreed. So that's what we're doing now. Because I also get one and next confused, and yeah, who knows?
True.
So,
Yeah, this
um,
one would definitely be on both of our lists for sure. Yeah.
cool.
The Lazy DM is such a great resource. It will change the way you think about game prep, running games. Mike Shea is a absolute brilliant genius when it comes to how to be an effective dungeon master, and not just effective dungeon master, but also like how to, make the most out of what you have and do as little work as possible. And his podcast, there is an industry and review part of it, but there's also episodes devoted to just him planning out the next game for his group. And if that's a great opportunity to be a fly on the wall and he'll just walk through his process. It's the same thing every week, but just with a different session coming up. And you want to talk about something to put on and listen to in the background while you're doing something else, or at least, maybe your first couple of times even take notes if you want to. But like, I found it so reassuring to listen to his prep episodes because it's just a reminder that like you don't need to do all of these like convoluted things to prep for your game. And he'll just prove it to you every time he does it. So it's a great refresher as to like this is like a brilliant and efficient way to plan for your next gaming session. Can't recommend it enough. And
Yeah,
then
and the industry takes, though he does definitely have opinions about industry stuff as someone who publishes under OGL. Like, they're not clickbaity. He's not like outrage farming. He is either legitimately outraged or being really positive. Like, there was a segment on the one today that was just like, what does it mean for other companies to be on D&D Beyond? Like, is D&D Beyond too good? Like, and he had this kind of like thinking about it, like this is what I mean. Like obviously I'm not mad about it. It was cool. It was a cool conversation. That was like, damn, I wish I would have thought about that topic and we'd recorded it before I heard this.
we still can. But the criticism, when Mike Shea levels criticism towards something, even if he is really upset about it, it's genuine. It is something that you can hang your hat on. Like when his teardown is not the right word, but his reaction to Spelljammer and how it landed, it's like is very well thought out, and it's from the position of somebody who passionately supports D&D and loves Wizards of the Coast up to that point. I don't know how he feels about it now because I don't listen to the podcast anymore because I don't listen to podcasts. But back then, you could understand that this person is a passionate fan of the product, first and foremost. And I think that's an important thing to remember because it's so easy to become jaded of the industry, of Wizards of the Coast, of what's happening around gaming. So it's often great to have the perspective of somebody who still has a genuine passion for the product and the hobby.
Yep. And
All right,
speaking of people that have passion for the hobby, I think this is going to be my last one.
this is what
The
we'll end on.
Legend of the Painty Men
Yes, The Legend of the Painty Men.
is how do you describe the Legend of the Painty Men? So take two pretty funny comics who have obviously done a lot of improv work. Get them real high and then let them talk about playing Warhammer: The Age of Sigmar, um, and then wherever that goes. And there's little skits and bits that they do because they're just two dudes who are real high, talking about like this strange hobby that I'm into of buying tiny plastic soldiers and painting them, and the world that it exists in, and it's just really funny.
Yeah. And the reason why we're going to end on this one is also on my list, is that I don't know anything about the Warhammer war game. Like I don't paint miniatures. I don't know what any of this shit means, but I never miss an episode of this podcast. When this pops up in my feed, or at least when I used to listen to podcasts, when this would pop up into my feed, I would stop whatever I was listening to and listen to the Painty Men immediately because it's super fucking funny and I don't even know what the fuck they're talking about, but I'm like having a blast and like cackling in the background, of whatever I'm doing, wherever I'm at, because it's so fucking funny and so entertaining. And I think that's an amazing thing to be able to do a podcast about such a niche topic. This isn't just a gaming topic. This is wargaming, it's Warhammer, it's Age of Sigmar. It's just further and further down this rabbit hole. And it's like it was one of my all-time favorite podcasts when I was listening to podcasts, just because I fucking enjoyed it.
Yep.
I don't even know how to paint a fucking miniature.
It is also, I should mention, they make it look like we don't swear, and it can be a bit crude at times, but it's still really funny.
Yep. 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 All right. Well, those are been some of our favorite gaming podcasts. And listeners, if you have a podcast you think Jesse should check out, and maybe if I ever get back to listening to podcasts on a serious basis, I'll check them out as well. But that's one of the things, is it's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to extra content. Jesse and I grew up in a world of gaming that didn't have this. We had like at best maybe zines, or like when the internet was forming, like online like chat groups or whatever the fuck we did back then.
You could play
Uh,
Dark Sun on AOL through the Red Dragon.
yeah, well, we just didn't have this kind of exposure to like so many different voices, so many different perspectives, so much great insight, so much just commentary. Just what a great way to connect with your people by being able to listen to it every week. So we thought, why not do an episode that celebrates the podcast that we enjoyed and inspired us. And listeners, if you have further additions to that list, we'd love to hear about it. Send them to jauntymantis@gmail.com or Juwanty on Twitter or X. And there might also be other social media out there. I have no idea.
Yeah. So just for as the credit music plays, I'm just gonna do the honorable mentions that are not gaming podcasts.
Go for it.
Okay, here we go. Heavyweight, Reply All, Search Engine, pretty much everything Gimlet made. Okay, thanks.
All right, get out there and listen to some fucking role-playing game podcasts.
Yeah, we have like lots of bonus episodes, 2 whole seasons. Listen to this one more.
Oh,
and
yeah.
5-star review.
What are you, my Uber driver?